All right, so for problem number 9, we want to find the answer to some trig functions, cosine of theta and secant of theta, and we're given a trig function. Ultimately, we want to use the Pythagorean identities, but before we go directly to the formulas, I prefer to work with sine, cosine, and tangent rather than cosecant, secant, and cotangent. So I'm going to use the fact that cosecant's reciprocal is the sine of theta. So if cosecant of theta is equal to negative 3 over 2, well then sine of theta is equal to negative 2 over 3. Eventually, we're going to have to know what the sign of our answers are. So I might as well start there. With all students take calculus. We are not going to be in quadrants 1 or 2. The reason we're not going to be in quadrants 1 or 2 is because if sine of theta is equal to negative 2/3, in other words, sine of theta is equal to a negative number, in quadrant 1 and in quadrant 2, sine is positive. A for all trig functions are positive in quadrant 1. S for sine is positive in quadrant 2. So we can eliminate quadrants 1 and 2 right away. We also know that secant of theta is less than 0. Less than 0 means negative. So if you have a number less than 0, it's a negative number. And if secant is negative, well, the reciprocal function for secant is cosine. So if secant is negative, then cosine is negative. So we don't want to use any quadrants where the cosine is positive. So the cosine is positive in quadrants 1 and 4. So we want to eliminate those two quadrants. Now we know that we are located in quadrant 3. And now we'll go ahead and go to our identity. I'm going to grab sine squared of theta plus cosine squared of theta equals 1. And that notation, sine squared of theta, means sine of theta multiplied by sine of theta. So when I write it, I prefer to put the squared on the outside there. I'm going to substitute negative 2/3 in for the sine of theta. And then negative 2/3 multiplied by negative 2/3 is 4/9. Subtract 4/9 from both sides. To do that, you'll need a common denominator, so that 1 on the far right side is really 9 out of 9. So we'll have 9/9 minus 4/9, which is 5/9. Then to completely get cosine of theta alone, we're going to take the square root. Technically, right now, we have positive or negative. The square root of a fraction is the same thing as the square root of the numerator over the square root of the denominator. So we have square root of 5, and the square root of 9 gave us 3. Okay, now we have to decide positive or negative, but we are in quadrant 3, and the only trig functions that are positive in quadrant 3 are tangent and its reciprocal function, cotangent. So cosine is not positive in quadrant 3. So we are going to remove the plus or minus and keep just the minus. And then if we know the answer to cosine, well then we also know the answer to secant because they're reciprocal functions. My final answer for secant of theta, I want to rationalize that by multiplying the numerator and denominator by the square root of 5. And I end up getting negative 3 root 5 over 5.